Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
I looked into my sister's eyes while she whispered it under her breath, just quiet enough to make sure only I could hear it, but loud enough to make sure it hit like a slap to the face. She only does this so she can brag. She didn't even say it with venom, just that smug smirk she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. And that was the exact moment I realized I wasn't hosting Christmas for them anymore. I was doing it for someone else. I just didn't know who yet. For the past 3 months, I'd been scrimping every dime from my job as a dental office receptionist. Tips from grateful patients, change from lunch I skipped, birthday money I didn't touch. It all went into a glass jar I kept hidden in the back of my kitchen pantry. I called it my holiday redemption fund. It sounds silly now, but to me, it felt like the only way I could fix what had been falling apart between us for years. I didn't grow up thinking Christmas was about gifts or grandeur, but somewhere between losing mom and growing older, our family turned into one of those hollow Hallmark Channel versions of itself. Everyone showing up, smiling through gritted teeth, and leaving the moment the food was cold. And every year I'd try a little harder to glue the pieces back together with gingerbread and tinsel. This year, I went all in. I didn't ask anyone to bring a dish, not even paper plates. I said I had it handled, and that wasn't a lie. I bought the biggest turkey I could fit in my oven, 19 pounds, pre-brined organic. I baked homemade stuffing with dried cranberries and sausage, mashed Yukon Gold potatoes by hand, made gravy from drippings, not a packet. I even learned to make my own Parker House rolls because I wanted everything to be warm, soft, and from scratch. I cooked with Christmas music on low-humming White Christmas while tasting cranberry sauce. I strung lights around the porch, hung real garland, polished every fork and wine glass. I printed place cards with names, bought ribbon for the napkins, and even made little peppermint bark gift bags for everyone to take home. My house smelled like nutmeg and effort. On Christmas Eve, the first to arrive was Jess, always first to show up, always last to help. She walked in like she was gliding into a gala, heels too tall for my hardwood floors, and a fur-collared coat swinging behind her. She kissed my cheek like she was kissing a marble statue, and glanced around the kitchen like she was taking inventory. "Wow," she said, drawing it out like a slow insult. "You really did the whole thing, huh?" I smiled, wiped my hands on my apron, and nodded. "Sure did." I tried not to care that she didn't offer to help unload her car or bring anything besides her husband Greg, who'd already made himself comfortable in the den with the TV remote. The night went on and family trickled in. Aunt Rosa with her quiet judgment, cousins whispering in the foyer, Dad already nursing his first bourbon. But still, I held hope. Maybe this was the year they'd notice. Maybe someone would say, "Monica, this is amazing," and mean it. Maybe they'd stay past dessert and actually talk about something other than whose kid got into which school, or how much Jess's bonus was. It was around 9:30 when I heard it. I'd just finished brushing butter onto the dinner rolls and turned to grab my cinnamon glaze for the carrots. Jess was near the fridge, her back to me, talking to our cousin Kelly, who was helping herself to wine. I stepped quietly behind them to grab the glaze from the top shelf, and that's when Jess leaned in and dropped the line that would unravel everything I'd been holding together. She only does this so she can brag. My breath caught like I'd been winded. I didn't flinch, didn't let her see me react. I just stood there, glaze bottle in hand, and pretended I hadn't heard. But I did. I heard every word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of Jess's voice repeating in my head like a skipping record. I thought about everything I'd done to make this holiday happen. How I'd given up dinners out, hair appointments, new shoes, even a doctor's appointment I'd needed, just to afford those steaks for Dad, and the gluten-free sides for Aunt Rosa. I thought about how none of them asked if I needed help, and how none of them ever stayed behind to do dishes or check on me after. I thought about how, no matter how hard I tried, Jess always found a way to spin it as selfishness. And in that sleepless stretch between midnight and morning, something in me broke, quietly like a twig in a forest no one hears fall. By 6 a.m., I was in my robe, silently wrapping the turkey in foil and tucking the rolls into their basket. I packed every dish into aluminum trays, sealed tight with love and resentment. I poured cider into a gallon jug, tied up the pie boxes, and carefully placed the peppermint bark bags into a cooler. My driveway was frozen and still dark when I loaded the trunk. The neighborhood was asleep. My hands shook a little, maybe from cold, maybe from nerves. I didn't know where I was going yet. I just knew I couldn't feed them. Not this year, not after that. As I backed out of my driveway, headlights off, I glanced back at the house. The lights still twinkled in the windows. It looked like a postcard, like a perfect Christmas. But inside it was empty, just as empty as I felt. I didn't have a plan. But I had a full car, a full heart, and a burning need to rewrite the ending of the story. Wherever I was headed, it was going to be somewhere I was actually appreciated. And as I pulled out onto the main road, my phone buzzed. A message from Jess in the family group chat. "Mon, we'll be there around noon. Want us to bring anything?" I didn't reply. I didn't even open it. Instead, I just turned up the heat, gripped the steering wheel, and whispered to myself, "They'll find out soon enough." The roads were nearly empty, just a handful of early risers wrapped in coats of frost, their breath turning white in the December cold. As I made my way toward the edge of town, with the trunk filled to bursting, every aluminum tray and casserole dish clinking quietly like a guilty conscience riding in the back seat. I didn't have a real destination when I pulled out of my driveway. No carefully charted course, no handwritten address on a sticky note stuck to the dashboard. Just a growing ache in my chest and the overwhelming need to put the food somewhere it might actually matter, somewhere it wouldn't be met with side eyes and snide remarks whispered behind wine glasses. So I drove east, past the stores just opening for last-minute shoppers, past the church parking lot starting to fill with congregants in red scarves and modest heels, until I found myself sitting at a red light in front of a brick building I'd passed 1,000 times but never truly seen. The sign above the door read Hope Haven Shelter, painted in simple white block letters on a faded navy awning, and I remember thinking how unremarkable it looked. Just a squat 2-story structure with mismatched shutters and a drooping wreath on the door. But somehow, in that moment, it felt like exactly where I needed to be. I turned in without thinking, tires crunching over gravel, heart thudding against my ribs in a rhythm that said, "Are you really doing this?" I parked beneath a flickering streetlight, took one last look at the mountain of perfectly prepared food in my back seat, and stepped out into the cold, unsure of what I'd say, what I'd do, or how I'd even explain myself to a room full of strangers, expecting nothing and receiving, quite literally, Christmas on a silver platter. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and old floors, a combination of holiday spirit and overuse. And a kind-looking woman behind the front desk looked up from a clipboard with tired but curious eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Not unfriendly, but cautious, as though unsure whether I was there to complain, volunteer, or cry. I cleared my throat, still wrapped in my coat, still tasting the sting of Jess's voice in my ears, and said something that surprised even me. "I brought Christmas dinner, everything, the whole thing. I want to donate it, now, if that's okay." There was a moment of silence, the kind that stretches too long and makes you question whether you've said something absurd, and then the woman blinked, stood slowly from her chair, and asked, "You brought the food? For today? For all of us?" I nodded, and in that instant, the stiffness in her shoulders gave way to something softer, gratitude maybe, or disbelief, because she opened the door wider, gestured toward the hallway, and said, "Come on, let's get it inside before it gets cold." What followed was a blur of movement, steam, and gentle chaos as I carried tray after tray into their dining hall, a space filled with long folding tables dressed in mismatched tablecloths, tinsel garland taped to the walls, and a handful of volunteers setting up paper plates and cheap plastic cutlery, with the kind of quiet diligence that speaks of experience. One older man with a cane stood up to help me with the heavier pans, asking nothing, just offering hands and warmth like it was second nature. No one asked why I had done it. No one questioned why a woman in dress boots and a Christmas sweater was unloading a roasted turkey bigger than most kitchen sinks. They just accepted it, like kindness wasn't a mystery that needed explaining. I stayed to help serve, something I hadn't planned but couldn't imagine walking away from. Not when the room began to fill with men and women who looked more tired than hungry. People whose shoes didn't match, whose coats were too thin, whose children clung to their legs like lifelines. They sat quietly at first, some whispering thanks, others just nodding, their eyes lingering on the food like they hadn't seen real stuffing or golden brown rolls in years. And when I spooned gravy over a man's mashed potatoes and he whispered, "This tastes like my mama's," something inside me cracked open, not in sadness, not even in pity, but in a kind of fierce, aching clarity that this, right here, was what Christmas was supposed to feel like. While I handed out the peppermint bark bags I'd so carefully tied with ribbon the night before, my phone buzzed 3 times in my back pocket, ignored each time. I didn't need to check it to know it was the family group chat. I could already picture the messages. "Monica, where are you? Is everything okay? We're here. Where's the food?" And Jess, of course, probably already blaming me before stepping 1 foot through my front door. But I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. Not while I was standing in a room full of strangers who looked at me like I'd just given them the world, even if it was just a warm plate and a cookie wrapped in foil. It wasn't until the meal was nearly finished, until most plates had been licked clean and paper napkins crumpled into soft white hills, that the shelter director pulled me aside. She was the same woman from the front desk, now apron draped and splattered with gravy, eyes misting just slightly as she asked me quietly, "Can I ask, what made you do this?" I opened my mouth to answer, to explain everything, the saving, the planning, the betrayal, the hurt. But all I managed was, "Because they didn't deserve it." She didn't press. She just nodded slowly and said, "Well, we're grateful that you thought of us instead." Back in my car, the trunk empty, the warmth of the shelter still clinging to my clothes, I finally pulled out my phone. 57 unread messages, most from Jess, some from Dad, a few from Aunt Rosa asking if she should start without me. The last one caught my eye. A photo from my own front porch, snapped by someone in the group. "The lights are on, but no one's home. What's going on?" I didn't answer, not yet. But I scrolled to the pictures I had taken, smiling kids holding brownies, a man in a threadbare coat laughing as he raised a cup of cider, that long table full of people who looked full, warm, and real. And I knew I was about to show my family what gratitude actually looked like. I hit send, 1 photo, no caption, just truth. And as I watched the little delivered checkmark appear beneath the image, I could almost hear the silence spreading through the group chat like wildfire. They were expecting a feast. What they got was a mirror. By the time the first knock landed on my front door, firm and slightly annoyed, I was already 2 miles away, parked beneath a half-decorated municipal Christmas tree in an empty lot behind the post office, sipping lukewarm cider from a styrofoam cup and staring at the blank screen of my phone like it held all the answers I still hadn't figured out. The photo I had sent to the group chat, the one of the long table at the shelter, filled with people who looked like they'd just tasted hope, had been seen. That much I knew. Each message I received after that had the frantic, uneven cadence of people trying to understand something they had never expected to experience. Absence, rejection, a holiday turning sideways with no clear villain in sight. The reactions were slow at first. Tentative questions, veiled concern, attempts to reach me without appearing too accusatory. But as the minutes passed and they stood in a house that was lit, clean, and completely void of food, warmth, or the woman who had always orchestrated the chaos, the tone began to change. My sister Jess was the first to respond with any kind of edge, naturally. "Very funny, Monica. If this is a prank, it's not cute." That was followed by Greg chiming in, asking if we'd ordered in or if the oven was broken. A comment I knew was less about logistics and more about diffusing the tension with sarcasm. Cousin Kelly sent a question mark, nothing else. And Aunt Rosa, bless her stubborn, traditional heart, asked flatly, "Is this supposed to be some modern version of fasting? Because I did not skip breakfast to wait for a life lesson." Even Dad weighed in, simply typing, "What's going on?" which, in his language, was the equivalent of mild panic. But I didn't respond. I sat there in that parking lot, watching the breeze ruffle discarded napkins and fast food bags around the curb, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete, uncontested control of the moment. Meanwhile, back in my house, the one I had scrubbed from baseboards to ceiling fans, decorated with the care of someone trying to stitch something back together with fairy lights and evergreen boughs, my family wandered through the rooms like guests at an open house, examining every corner as if they might find their dinner tucked behind a scented candle or hidden in the oven like a cruel game of hide and seek. Jess, true to form, took charge in the way only someone completely lacking self-awareness could manage. She flung open the refrigerator, called out that there was literally nothing but condiments and leftover yogurt, then declared that I must have had some kind of mental breakdown. When no one corrected her, I imagined she felt justified in that theory. But it was Greg who noticed the missing baking pans first. "If she didn't cook, where are all her trays?" he asked. And that's when the questions became real. Because the dishes were gone, yes, and the counters wiped down to an eerie shine. But the faint scent of roasted turkey still clung to the air, stubborn and unmistakable, like a memory refusing to die. That was when they started to realize something larger had happened. Not a mistake, not a prank, a choice. A deliberate and calculated choice made by someone they had always assumed would be there. Apron on, smile forced, martyrdom polished and ready for consumption, right alongside the ham. At some point, Dad sat down in the living room with his jacket still on and didn't say a word, just stared at the Christmas tree that blinked in rhythm with the blinking disbelief now spreading through the room. Cousin Kelly tried to laugh it off, mumbled something about ordering pizza, but even that fell flat. No one wanted to be the first to leave, but no one wanted to stay in a house that now felt like a statement. Because it wasn't just about the missing food, it was about the message, delivered in silence and aluminum trays, filled with meaning. I had told them, without saying a word, that they weren't the center of the universe anymore. As the text thread slowed, I sent one more photo. This one was different. It showed a boy, maybe 7 or 8, cheeks red from the cold, a knitted hat barely clinging to his ears, holding a plate piled with stuffing, turkey, green beans, and mashed potatoes. He wasn't smiling for the camera. He was smiling at the food. Behind him, others waited their turn, their expressions ranging from stunned to reverent. And the shelter staff worked in the background with quiet urgency. I didn't caption it. I didn't need to. The image said more than I ever could. I imagine it hit harder than anything I could have written. That food, their food, my work and effort and care, had gone to someone who genuinely appreciated it. And for a family raised on appearances and polite facades, the raw truth of that photo had to sting like vinegar on a paper cut. Back at the house, according to a message I got from my cousin an hour later, Jess lost it. She demanded to know what kind of stunt I thought I was pulling, accused me of trying to humiliate everyone on purpose, and insisted I explain myself right now or don't bother coming back. Aunt Rosa apparently asked if I had joined some kind of cult. Greg kept checking his phone, probably hoping I'd magically appear and declare it all a performance art piece. No one wanted to say the word rejected, but they all felt it. They felt abandoned, and for once, they didn't know who to blame but themselves. Meanwhile, I took a long walk around the block, boots crunching over salt-dusted sidewalks, the sky dimming into a hazy gray. As dusk crept in and the Christmas cheer on the radio felt increasingly disconnected from the reality I was living, I wasn't sure how I felt. Not triumphant, not quite sad either. There was something deeper brewing, something less clear-cut, as if my decision had opened a door I hadn't realized was locked until that very moment. I had taken something they believed was theirs by default and given it to people who needed it more. That wasn't revenge. It was redistribution. But it was also a line crossed, and I knew the way back wasn't going to be paved with cookies and apologies. By nightfall, the group chat was silent, like a battlefield after the last shot has been fired. I turned off my phone, made myself a cup of tea, and curled up on the couch with a fleece blanket, surrounded by candles and quiet. Outside, somewhere across town, my family probably sat around a greasy takeout box, chewing in awkward silence, wondering how I dared to flip the script so completely. And I knew this wasn't over, not even close. By the time I finally returned home, long after dusk had settled over the quiet, snow-dusted streets of my neighborhood, and the soft golden glow of porch lights blinked like distant beacons of normalcy, I knew I was stepping into something different from anything I'd ever faced before. Not just awkwardness, not just irritation, but a tension that had curled itself deep into the bones of my family, and was now waiting for a place to land, a place to erupt, and inevitably, that place would be me. The driveway was empty, and the silence of the house was complete. The kind of stillness that doesn't soothe but instead amplifies every thought, every shadow, every lingering trace of words that had been exchanged or withheld only hours earlier. As I turned the key and stepped through the door, I could still smell faint traces of what had once been a Christmas feast. It was no longer rich and warm and inviting, but ghost-like, an echo of something that had happened elsewhere, somewhere more deserving. The chairs around the dining table remained precisely where I had set them, untouched, their positions like sentinels bearing witness to what might have been. The place cards, carefully written in my neatest cursive and tucked into folded linen napkins, still sat expectantly in front of each plate, and the soft flicker of a dying candle sputtered in the centerpiece like a final breath, stubbornly holding on to a celebration that had never truly begun. I didn't have long to take it in before my phone began vibrating again, this time with renewed purpose. The group chat had reignited with the fiery energy of a family whose comfort had been disrupted, whose entitlement had been questioned in a way they couldn't begin to process. Jess's name filled the screen repeatedly. She had clearly abandoned any attempt at subtlety and was now leaning fully into confrontation, texting demands for explanations, sarcastic jabs, and not-so-veiled accusations with the fury of someone who believed, deep down, that everything should orbit her convenience. I barely had time to read the latest. Was this supposed to make us feel guilty, Monica? Because it worked. Congrats. When there was a sharp knock at the door, followed immediately by another, harder this time, like the person on the other side was determined not to give me the option of silence. I opened it slowly, unsurprised to find Jess standing there, coat clutched tightly around her shoulders, cheeks flushed not from the cold, but from pure, seething disbelief. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stormed past me, boots tracking a line of melting snow across the hardwood, her eyes scanning the room with an almost theatrical blend of outrage and disorientation. "So this is it," she said, her voice loud and sharp against the quiet, hands gesturing at the untouched table. "You just decided to what? Punish us? Shame us in front of each other? Turn Christmas into some moral lesson for the rest of us who didn't spend the last 3 months martyring ourselves over yams and centerpieces?" I didn't say anything at first. I just closed the door behind her and let the weight of her words settle like smoke in the air. She was furious, but underneath it I could tell she was confused and maybe even a little scared, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who I was anymore. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, not cold, not angry, just resolute. I told her that I hadn't done it to punish anyone. I hadn't done it to make a scene, or to shame the family, or to claim some moral high ground. I had done it because for the first time, I realized that doing everything for people who never once said thank you, never once stayed late to help with dishes, never once saw the toll it took on me to play host, cook, cleaner, planner, and therapist, all in one breath, was not generosity. It was servitude masquerading as tradition, and I was done pretending that it was enough to simply be needed. I wanted to be appreciated, and I had learned, the hard way, that sometimes the only way to make people see you clearly is to stop being so convenient. Jess scoffed, shook her head, called me dramatic and self-righteous and manipulative. All the usual labels she reached for whenever someone challenged the version of reality she kept so tightly wound around herself. She accused me of humiliating our father, embarrassing Aunt Rosa, even of turning the kids into props for your social experiment. Her voice rising with each sentence until it cracked at the edge of something brittle. But I didn't flinch. I just let her unravel, let the weight of her own entitlement sit heavily in the silence that followed her last accusation. And when she finally demanded to know what I wanted from all of this, what possible satisfaction I could have gotten from watching our family stumble around in confusion and hunger, I told her the truth. I wanted them to feel what I had felt for years. Invisible, taken for granted, expected but not valued, present but never really seen. And I told her, without raising my voice, that the people at the shelter, people with nothing, had given me more gratitude in one meal than my own family had given me in a decade of Christmases. I said it not to wound, but to reveal something she had never considered, that maybe the problem wasn't me being too dramatic, but them being too comfortable with someone else doing all the work. She didn't respond right away. She stood there, jaw set, arms crossed, looking at me like I had become a stranger in my own house. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her with a finality that told me this was not over, not even close. But it was a beginning, a crack in the carefully constructed image of our family, a rupture in the illusion that everything would always be as it had always been. Later that night, I turned my phone back on and scrolled through the group chat one last time. The photos I had sent still sat there, unanswered, untouched. The final message from Jess was a single line. "You'll regret this, Monica." I stared at it for a long time, not because I believed it, but because I understood it. Regret is what people feel when the world doesn't bend to their expectations. And in that moment, I realized something both unsettling and liberating. I wasn't afraid of being the villain in their story. Not anymore. The morning after Christmas arrived, not with the usual haze of sleepiness and leftover pie for breakfast, but with a thick quiet that settled over the house like dust after a long-forgotten storm. And for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't wake up to the screech of aluminum foil being peeled off half-eaten casseroles, the sound of my father clanking coffee mugs in the kitchen, or the distant drone of Jess pretending to be helpful while scanning her phone for sales that marked the beginning of her true holiday ritual. Instead, I lay in bed beneath a too-heavy quilt, staring at the ceiling, listening to a house that had finally exhaled, no longer forced to perform a holiday routine it never really believed in, and feeling, despite everything, a strange sense of stillness, the kind that follows a decision you didn't think you were brave enough to make until it was already behind you. I had expected, perhaps foolishly, that by the time the sun rose and the day shook off its silence, I would feel some great release, some moment of clarity or vindication that would make all the discomfort of the day before seem worthwhile. But what I felt instead was more complicated, something messier and harder to name. It wasn't regret, not even close, but it also wasn't the neat satisfaction that storybook endings promise, the kind where the heroine stands tall while the world applauds her for finally standing up for herself. No, what I felt was the soft ache of consequence, the lingering taste of a truth served cold, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. By noon, no one had reached out again. The group chat remained dormant, our family's digital heartbeat flatlined after the previous day's flurry of rage and confusion. There were no apologies, no declarations of understanding, no invitations to talk. I didn't expect them to be quick to reconcile. I knew how pride worked in our family. We were bred on silence, raised on the belief that emotional endurance meant never speaking first, never admitting you were hurt unless it could be turned into a joke or a deflection, and certainly never acknowledging that someone else's pain might deserve a place at the table. It was a trait I had inherited and then spent years trying to unlearn, and this Christmas had become the battlefield where that internal war finally turned outward. Later in the afternoon, as the sky shifted from pale winter blue to the soft, melancholic gray of early twilight. I found myself sitting in the same living room I had decorated with such careful optimism only days before, now surrounded by the aftermath of an event that never took place. The untouched presents beneath the tree, still wrapped in shiny gold and red paper. The bowls of unused cranberries. The wreath on the door slowly drying out, its needles beginning to fall like quiet confessions onto the mat below. I thought about what it meant to spend so much time and energy preparing for a moment you knew, deep down, would never happen the way you wanted it to, and how painful it was to finally admit that love, when unreciprocated, begins to feel a lot like self-neglect dressed up in holiday cheer. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because the sadness had taken a different shape. It had hardened into something reflective, something that no longer needed to erupt in tears to be felt. I realized, sitting there with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hands, that what I had done wasn't just about revenge or making a point. It was about reclaiming something I had lost over years of giving, compromising, and hosting. It was about reminding myself that I mattered, not just as the organizer or the chef or the sister who could be counted on to make everything look seamless, but as a person with limits, with needs, with a breaking point that could no longer be ignored. And yet, even with that realization, the quiet was not entirely peaceful. There were questions I couldn't shake, doubts that curled around the edges of my certainty like frost on a window pane. Would this become the rift that finally broke our family apart for good? Would they ever see what I saw? That what happened wasn't cruelty, but a necessary reset? Would Jess ever understand that her offhanded comment was not the root of the decision, but merely the final crack in a dam that had been leaking for years? Would Dad, in his silent, bourbon-soaked way, recognize that fatherhood extended beyond presence and into acknowledgement? I didn't know, and the truth was, I wasn't sure I needed to anymore. Just before dusk turned fully to night, I stepped outside, wrapped in a thick cardigan, coffee cup refilled and steaming in the cold air, and stood on the front porch watching the lights I had strung weeks ago blink on in gentle waves. They still glowed brightly, their colors soft against the snow, a reminder that beauty doesn't always fade just because it goes unnoticed. I watched the neighborhood settle into its own version of post-Christmas calm, heard the distant sounds of laughter from a house down the street, the gentle hum of a car engine starting, and for a moment, I felt like I existed on the edge of something, not quite resolution, not quite estrangement, but a new kind of space where I could breathe without apologizing for the air I took up. As the last of the light faded, I considered whether I should reach out, send a message, offer a note of explanation, maybe even a peace offering disguised as a joke, but something held me back. Not pettiness, not fear, just the quiet certainty that if healing was going to happen, it had to start somewhere other than the place where I had always been expected to begin it. Maybe they would come around, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe next Christmas would look completely different. Or maybe there wouldn't be one at all, at least not with the same people, the same expectations. And maybe that was okay. Inside, the candles on the mantel flickered, casting long shadows against the walls, and the silence no longer felt so heavy. I sat down, pulled the fleece blanket over my legs, and picked up a novel I'd been meaning to read for months, its spine still stiff, its pages still unmarked. As I opened it, I realized that this too was a kind of beginning, a story I hadn't yet lived, one that I might finally have the time, space, and emotional bandwidth to experience without interruption. Because the truth is, not every act of rebellion is loud. Not every declaration of worth needs an audience. Sometimes it's in the quiet refusal to keep performing the same role that real change takes root. And if my family chose to see that as betrayal, then perhaps they were never really seeing me at all. Whether they would come to understand that remained to be seen. But as for me, I had finally given myself permission to stop waiting. And in that silence, there was, for the first time in years, a kind of peace.